In November 2019, the Justice Policy Institute issued a report, but the information in that report is very startling. Maryland is higher than any other state and double more than the national average when it comes to incarcerating young Black men. This is not acceptable. Our panelists this evening include Aisha Braveboy, who is the Prince George's County State's Attorney. We also have with us this evening Eric Barron, who is the Prince George's County Maryland delegate in the House of Representatives and has been since 2015. And we're so glad to have you, Mr. Barron. We also have Calvin Hawkins with us, Prince George's County Council Vice Chair. He's an at-large member who's been on the council since 2018. And we have Mel Franklin, who is also an at-large member, who was formerly from District 9 and now serves at large. And so we are very happy to have you all with us this evening. And so we're going to jump right into it. What do you believe are the primary causes of this disproportionate impact of young Black men incarcerated in the state and in Prince George's County?
So we see that, but what we also see, and what I've also seen, is that we have a number of people in our system who get pretty lengthy sentences. Now, some of it is based on the nature of the offense. So if you commit a murder, your maximum penalty is life. And sometimes the state seeks life, sometimes it seeks some other term number of years for incarceration. But what I see is that based on the nature of the offense and the criminal history of that individual, we have something called sentencing guidelines, which judges use to impose sentences on individuals. And those guidelines, depending on your criminal history, could be pretty large. I mean, pretty lengthy in terms of the number of the number of years you might face if you commit certain types of offenses. So I do see it as many factors, but primarily in terms of why we're seeing it in Prince George's County, I can tell you is because of the nature of the offense and the criminal history of those defendants, seriousness of the offense. But I do believe that we can look at our sentencing guidelines. I think we can give more reconsiderations than we are given in the system to give people an opportunity after serving a period of time to be reconsidered in terms of their sentence.
And what we have to really look at is we have this honest conversation, how these young men and get into our system. Certainly we can talk about their juvenile delinquency. We can talk about some of the family issues that have impacted them to the extent that they are now members of our penal system. But we also have to look at what James Foreman Jr. said in his book, Locking Up Our Own, when he talks about, we talk about as a racist system, but there are Black prosecutors, Black judges, and a whole African-American law enforcement system that's helping create the number of individuals we see incarcerated. But again, we must understand our communities are calling out crime, crime. We got to do something with the crime. But now as we deal with Black Lives Matter, we are uncovering our role in this as well. And I think what we need to do is continue to have these open discussions. And you all should have a discussion with some of our prosecutors around the state, and maybe they'll become progressive like our state's attorney in addressing some of the issues and coming up with alternatives to incarceration.
Just to echo some of what's already been said, I think the biggest drivers for mass incarceration really are economic disparities, which then lead to, I think, a lot of criminal conduct that is driven by that despair and those disparities. When you look at nonviolent drug offenses, when you look at other offenses even less serious, we really have to look at the kind of offenses that are resulting in so much of our incarceration in our community. And then I'm really more talking about nonviolent offenses and those kind of offenses that are really driving up those numbers. And then, you know, and I'm sure as our state's attorney has seen, you know, you start to see young men particularly, but young people get caught up in the system shortly after their juvenile years are over. And then it worsens into more serious conduct because they're already trapped in the system. So they get trapped in the system through less serious conduct. And because they then get that criminal record, it impedes their ability to get employment, housing, other things that then traps them in a cycle of criminal conduct. Ultimately, the real answer is, you know, how do we create legitimate pathways for our young people in particular, but other ex-offenders so that they don't get trapped in this cycle of going back to the same kind of conduct that got them there in the first place. If our society continues to so aggressively discriminate against those who've gotten convictions, we're going to continue to have the same problem. If ex-offenders cannot find adequate and successful employment and economic opportunities, entrepreneurship, other opportunities, those members of our society are going to continue to be in this cycle. So if we don't address the questions of, you know, how long should it be before a felony conviction stops preventing you from getting a job or getting housing? How long is it going to be before misdemeanor prevents you from getting employment or getting housing? If we don't address those issues, we're going to continue to have this same conversation 20, 30 years from now.
First is just very simply and broadly, we have a justice system that in many ways codifies and exacerbates long-standing racial and socioeconomic inequality, dating back since at least the Jim Crow era. You can draw a direct line from Jim Crow to many of the laws we still have on the books. Two, if you look at when someone gets justice involved, from the arrest through pretrial, through the trial process, sentencing, and through and including reentry and supervision, there's discretion at each one of those steps. And that discretion is inevitably exercised disproportionately against Black men. And so from that point on, from arrest through, it builds on and builds on. And then when you have the cycle that Councilmember Franklin talked about, it's almost impossible to break through. And lastly, I'd point out, and all these things are interrelated, but we criminalize poverty, we criminalize healthcare issues, fines and fees that will send you into prison, mental illness will send you into jail in our state and our country. The disease of addiction will have you incarcerated. 2/3 of our incarcerated population are there for nonviolent drug offenses. So, you know, those are, you know, three things that we have to contend with, and it's a lot. So I'm glad we have in this panel to, you know, delve into how we can further make grounds on reversing what is an injustice.
Returning citizen, I'm not an ex-offender, but I am a reformed citizen, someone who spent 5 years and 9 months of my life in prison. So I know the other side, the side where grown men cry. The question that was asked, one of the things that I first saw when I got on the county council was the lack of reformative initiatives for those who were returning from incarceration. It was individuals like Councilmember Mel Franklin and the other council members that were open to having these real discussions about how we help. And one of the challenges we face, and it's good that we have a supportive state's attorney, but one of the challenges we face, and even talking to the county exec, she was on board, there's not a real connection between individuals who are incarcerated when they return home. I'm dealing with an individual now, and he's been home for maybe 45 days after 21 years. And the challenges he's facing with just getting his ID, just getting the things he needs to get a job. You need identification in order to get things. From the time he was in prison to the individuals he's working with out here, there's such a disconnect. And one of the things at the local level that I'm really concerned about is how we change individuals coming specifically back to Prince George's, whether they're coming from a federal prison, a state prison, or our local jail, having the necessary documentation to get them the kind of services they need, and setting up with Councilmember Franklin a program that not only give them opportunities to work, but housing. Many people ask us, well, what about halfway houses in the county? You all need to put halfway houses in the county. No, you got to go and talk to those communities, because you all know how it is. We all talk about reform and liberation, but how many of us really want a halfway house in our community? So those are some of the challenges we face on the council with coming up with ideas. But I assure you, for the next 2 years that I'm in office, working with my colleagues, reentry and reformative initiatives to help individuals returning to our community is high on my list of priorities.
That is is being pushed and advocated for, the way that you see other agendas. I mean, when we run for office every 4 years, we get demands from unions and environmental groups and a variety of groups from one end of the spectrum to the other. But we don't really hear from the reentry community. I think we as elected officials have to work more in tandem with activists to really craft what is the agenda around reentry, and how do we then hold folks accountable who are running for office, as well as once they get elected, for that agenda. What are the demands for improving reentry in Prince George's County and across Maryland? What's our list of 10 or 20 policy changes that we want to see? Do we want to see prohibitions against employment discrimination, housing discrimination on the basis of felonies that are more than 5 years old, or misdemeanors more than 3 years old? Do we want to see incentive programs around encouraging employers to hire returning citizens? I can tell you right now, I encounter employers all the time who are interested in hiring returning citizens. It would be good to organize those employers in some one-stop shop fashion, where if you're a returning citizen, you know all of the employers, for example, in Prince George's County, who are willing to hire returning citizens. To really answer your question, Sandy, I would say it's more than just electing people who happen to be African-American. As my colleague Calvin Hawkins can tell you, we've had African-American elected officials for a couple of decades now in Prince George's County, actually beyond that, several decades. But we still struggle to get good participation for awarding contracts to African-American owned businesses in Prince George's County. That's even with African-Americans running procurement, running county government. So it's not just good enough to elect African-American public officials. We have to elect them with an agenda that we then hold, I say them, us, that we hold us accountable to. That's really what it comes down to.
Question number 2. What are the steps that you plan to take to impact this disparity? And what, if any, legislative or policy changes do you propose that will make a difference?
So we have expanded our diversion programs in the office since I've been there. We have more diversion programs, and we have grown the number of people in those diversion programs. We also, under the prior state's attorney, who is now our county executive, Angela also Brooks, she brought the Back on Track program that Kamala Harris started when she was the DA in San Francisco here to Prince George's County. And that program gives first-time drug offenders the opportunity to have a clean slate after going through a pretty intensive program. Well, that program served a relatively small number of people because the criteria was so narrow. And so we've now expanded that criteria, and we're in the process of adding more offenses that would be eligible for Back on Track, so that we give more people an opportunity to participate in this program.
This past session, I finally got through a bill that eliminates fines and fees for juveniles. So we're going to keep at it for everyone else.
Especially, I'm sorry to interrupt, but especially because people are making money off of people who are not able to pay these fines and fees.
Amen. And speaking of fines and fees and bail reform, pretrial reform. So I've been right in the middle of leading on, reforming our pretrial system.
I think we're going to have to go, above and beyond to try to make sure that our returning citizens community have their voices heard. Because as I said, usually you don't hear a lobbyist represent returning citizens. I hear lobbyists represent a lot of other groups. You don't hear about, returning citizens don't have PACs necessarily. So they're not making political. So all of these things that impact the political process that we see as elected officials all the time, oftentimes we don't hear from our returning citizens community. And so I mention that because, this is a great conversation, but we've had many great conversations about these issues. We want this to be different.
Thanks to everyone for your attention to this critically important issue. It's just such an important discussion, and as you said at the outset, in the research that we were happy to produce and hope is useful, showed that Maryland is in a crisis right now. We lead the nation in the percentage of Black people who are in our prisons. We lead the nation in the rate of young Black men going to prison for long prison terms. Nothing to be proud of. And so there's a lot of work to be done. I think the conversation tonight has been excellent, and the leadership that folks are showing is really encouraging. Mm-hmm. And so I hope we can continue to push forward, and the Justice Policy Institute is just happy to be a resource to anyone who's working on these issues. So thanks for the organizers, thanks to you, Alinda, and of course all of our elected officials for participating tonight.